Hey everyone, thank you so much for watching the Weaviate Podcast. I'm super excited about this podcast. We have Greg Kamradt and Colin Harmon. These two are both prolific entrepreneurs in the space of LLM agents. Greg has made all sorts of amazing content about LangChain and different examples of prompts, his AI early signal series. And Colin has given this really impressive lecture on hallucinations and how that is manifested in agents and how to fix it at the Haystack conference. So I thought it would be so exciting to bring these two together and just hash out everything with our current understanding of agents, LangChain, Llama Index, and just how this whole space is evolving. So first, guys, thank you so much for joining the podcast.
Absolutely. Thanks for having us.
Happy to be here.
Awesome. So could we do a round of intros? Greg, can you tell us about how you came to be working in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background is actually on the B2B products side of the house. So I used to run a growth team over at Salesforce for sales and service cloud. And then I was the first operations hire at Digits, which is a Series C fintech company. And I have a history of teaching people how to do data analysis and build data products. But this year, my focus has been teaching people how to use AI tools to build AI products. And it's just a fascinating space right now because not only is the applications evolving, but even the tools are evolving themselves. And so it's really a turbulent time, which is fun to be in.
Yeah, amazing. I think I can't speak to enough of how much your videos have helped me understand LangChain. And it's very cool hearing the Salesforce background because that write 100 sales emails with the Y Combinator video you did. I can't wait to dive into that because I think that's such an interesting topic with how this personalized retrieval augmented generation can impact that kind of thing. So before we dive into it any further, Colin, could you also kind of tell the story of how you came to be working in this space?
Yeah, absolutely. So a few years ago, I was working as a machine learning engineer and had some exposure to natural language processing and kind of decided to go all in on that. And that was, it turns out, a pretty good time to make that decision. And then, in my current role, I'm the head of technology at Nesh, which builds enterprise search and automation applications for heavy industries. So upon starting there, also got really into the information retrieval side of things. And as both of you know, both of those concepts have kind of exploded in the past year, 2 years. So it's been a great time to be in that area and following content like Connor's and Greg's has been super helpful and it's very important. So that's how I ended up here and now just trying to, find the future of how do you put these things into products and understand it properly.
Yeah, fascinating. I think maybe also to kick things off, if we could do a round of just how are we each thinking about LangChain, Llama Index, ChatGPT Marketplace, just generally this space of large language models using tools, this general concept of agency, how would you define it to someone?
I'll get started with that. But really, I think my opinion on it is a little, maybe a little more old school. Basically, I've been asking myself this question. Okay, we're talking about AI a lot, right? And a year ago, what did an AI team do? And what did you need to provide value with AI? And the answer to that was basically you needed a significant amount of talent, you needed a significant amount of data, and you needed, in many cases, a lot of compute resources as well, right? So that's what AI was. However, now with language models, if you want to be AI, you want to do language models, you don't need any of those things, right? Thanks to people like you guys, anyone can figure out how to use these and you don't need compute to do it. You can use it like a software tool. So I'm thinking of language models now as a type of software, just another block in the software stack. This is not AI, doesn't require special talent, doesn't require special data, right? Because the data comes with the tool. So broadly, I think of agents as a type of application that uses language models, right? And I think you're starting to see some hints of that from entities like Microsoft talking about things in that way as well. This is just the new normal, and it's going to be part of not every system, but a large proportion of systems out there. So agents in particular, if I were to make that more specific, I'd say agents are aspects of those applications that choose and use various subsystems. So I'll leave it at that and we can iterate on it a bit.
Yeah. And then just to join in on there, I 100% agree. I think that we're seeing a pattern here where you see an early iteration of a tool that's just clearly going to be what the future is going to look like. Now, the the other side of that coin is that the reliability piece. And so you're seeing things like the baby AGI and the AutoGPT. Is it a question that that's going to be the model for the future? Without a doubt, it won't be the exact same thing, but that sort of framework is going to be prevalent for sure. We aren't quite there yet because we're solving a whole bunch of other problems that come with it. But I am all in on agents. I'm a believer. Count me in for it.
Yeah, I think those are both great, great overviews from just the concept of just large language models being just like a compute primitive, this kind of like person in the computer that you can just put in any intermediate layer of some, transformation of data across an API or doing different kinds of skills that you can compress into natural language. So in preparing for this podcast, I took a look at LangChain's documentation to see like what's the newest, presentation of the ideas. And so Harrison, the latest abstraction is thinking that large language models are going to be based around, data aware large language models, and then agent centric. There's some kind of like agentic. I had never seen that word before, like agent IC. But so I see these two things as like, you connect to the data like in a vector database, and that's where, our interest around this really comes. And then also connecting with the APIs. So I guess kind of I want to start off by diving into the data aware LLMs and sort of what you guys are seeing with, I know Colin has done a lot of work on hallucinations, and, Greg has tons of videos on ingesting particular kind of data into something like a vector database so that you can then retrieve the context and facilitate the generation. So how are you guys currently thinking about this kind of like making large language models customized to your data through the use of like, connecting it to databases?
Yeah, I'll jump in quickly on that one. My view on it is it's a very romantic idea to think that a language model can do anything that you want it to, right? And it communicates and it story tells very well that you can throw whatever command at it, whatever data at it, and it's just going to magically return things back to you. But I think what we're seeing here is that language models are really good at some sort of tasks. They're not wonderful at all tasks, and that's okay because we don't want to overload the system with too many different types of requests. And an example of that is where you see people say, hey, language model, please think out loud first and then answer my question, as opposed to just, hey, go answer my question for that. So when it comes to adding data to the context of your language model, I see too many folks try to throw the kitchen sink and just throw every single thing that they can on there, where I think in reality, you can get a really long way with better prompting and more signal to noise ratio within the context that you're passing in the first place, which just speaks to the programmatic ability to do really awesome retrieval in the first place, as opposed to giving everything to the language model.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is about just how many places in kind of a search pipeline you can inject a large language model. So from data ingestion using the large language model to kind of extract and format the data for the schema. Say you have like this high H, lowercase y, capital D, capital E. It's like this idea of where you take a query and then you have the large language model generate a potential document and you search with that document. Or say using the large language model to cut the search results, say take 10 results, pass the language model says only give these 2 to the next step in the chain. Or say the large language model re-ranks it. It's like there's so many places to put the large language model in this kind of retrieval pipeline and get better search results. But I think a great topic, Colin, would be talking about this hallucination problem. How, like, where are we at with hallucination and fixing it with the kind of retrieval?
Yeah, I thought Greg brought up a great point, right? Asking the language model to do the wrong task. And that I would say is one of the big problems here. I was just talking to a client today about how you can do better on math problems when you use tree of thought, chain of thought prompting systems. But why would you want to solve a math problem probabilistically, because these models have a certain error rate on these math problems, when we know how to solve math problems, right? We've figured that out. That came with when computers were invented, right? So there's a big question of don't solve the wrong problem, or don't solve a problem with the wrong tool. Pick the right tool for the problem. And then getting back to, okay, like how do you use these language models and applications? Really, step one for 95% of applications is going to be connect this to your proprietary data or whatever data you're trying to attend your application over. So retrieval necessarily is the most important part of any of these real world language model applications, just because look at any software application, right? Those are based on data as well. Software applications use databases, they use search. Um, so the same thing needs to happen with language models, because if you don't do that, that's not a truly useful product. It's like a demo, right? Or you can do it in ChatGPT. So for most people building businesses, you need to build something better than what you can do in ChatGPT. And the easiest and most straightforward way to do that is connect to the important data. And that could be a vector index, a keyword index like BM25. It could also be a managed index like Bing Search API, or it could be a structured database, which I know, Connor, you're into the querying using language models thing, and we've been doing that for a while now too. And every single one of those can be optimized using language models throughout the process. So yeah, you have this concept of, okay, retrieve and then generate, but generate can also bleed into that retrieve step. And it doesn't have to be a one directional process, right? You can go back and forth. So there's a lot of ways to improve it, but at its most basic, you need to retrieve if you want to deliver business value.
Yeah, I love that. Not a one directional thing. I mean, as you mentioned, like, yeah, I love that. Like, I think now Llama Index and LangChain are both calling it the self querying retriever, where you ask it, like, like, how long do golden doodles live on average? It's a dark question. Think about the mortality of golden doodles, but like, and then you would give it like the symbolic schema that you like. Vector databases like Weaviate, in addition to storing your unstructured text chunks, you also usually have some symbolic data around the text chunks, and we integrate that kind of stuff into the vector index, so you have filtered search. But you give it the properties in the prompt, and it might say where animal equals dog, and then you have this symbolic filter. So there's like that notion to it, where you can just use more of the levers to the search engine. It kind of is like with WebGPT, you had these search actions, like do you want to scroll to the next page of the Bing search results, and this kind of thing. And but so there's like that, there's like using the LLM to control all the levers of the vector database. But I also really love this concept of like an interface. And this is kind of how I see client frameworks, even like stepping like into the software hat of like database client frameworks. Like I see something like LangChain Llama Index is orchestrating like Weaviate and like say Neo4j, and then like an SQL system, and like using the unique benefits of combining your data in each of these ways. Another kind of really interesting area of retrieval from different kinds of information sources. But I think it would be a great transition into this kind of tool use now, because we've already kind of transitioned from retrieval, and we're now kind of making it more like a tool. Like, I'm really curious about like how you guys are seeing things like, Zapier. I know Greg has opinions on Zapier, and like using the calendar APIs, and like how does the tool use kind of come into this picture?
Yeah, quickly on that one, I think just how I'm confident in that the agent paradigm will obviously be what's happening in the future. Tools are the other side of the coin that come with it. I mean, that's how you get them to interact with our lives. I just saw this quote within the Human Loop blog post that said Sam Altman suggested that a lot of people thought they wanted apps to be inside of ChatGPT. So they thought they wanted plugins in ChatGPT. But in reality, what they really wanted was ChatGPT in their apps. So it's not ChatGPT as the central point we're going to interact with all your tools. It's rather, because really, what's the incentive for the third-party applications to support that heavily, right? What they want is they want the users in their app, and they want the ChatGPT like abilities within their own app in the first place. So as we think about tools, I think it's going to be a really interesting dynamic between what's best for the user and what's best for the business. Because not unfortunately, but the way that market dynamics usually work is what's best for the business is what's going to come out in the very first place. Now, open source software will, of course, help out the user and go from there. But I think this is a dynamic we still don't know how it's going to play out quite yet.
It's so fascinating you brought that up. Like, Weaviate Podcast fans, stay tuned for a deep dive on ChatGPT Marketplace with Jana Wellander, who's building Craftful. So Craftful with a K is, it's like a product manager inside of ChatGPT, sort of. So what the product is it's like prompts that product managers use, like for analyzing customer feedback or like, suggestions for what you to do. So it's kind of like skill-based prompting. Like I think summarization has been one of the big, like the most successful skill to prompt it with, like create and refine, map, reduce, like how you summarize with a skill. And so on this ChatGPT Marketplace thing, oh man, I think this is so interesting. And especially like, Greg's such a prolific content creator. I think this applies to you so interestingly, is like, and yeah, like everyone really, but like imagine like taking all your expertise on how to use LangChain and like kind of setting up, like instead of like a course you would create, now you create like a set of prompts and it's like a product on the ChatGPT Marketplace. And coming back to that market dynamics thing and like the business around it, it's like, yes, I want the users in my app, but the exposure of the app store might be so much, like, kind of, it's pretty fascinating. I don't know. What do you think about that kind of, I mean, you've kind of, it's such an interesting topic to me, the difference between ChatGPT Marketplace versus just the API, but I think the Marketplace offers a lot of marketing.
Yeah, I'd say another part of it, really like maybe what goes under that Sam Altman quote, is that the LLM is a feature now of a different product, right? And a lot of people are still thinking of it as a product, but now it's just a feature, right? It's just software. So you have a lot of people working on projects that are, okay, like there's some tool I use, some software tool I use. Well, I'm going to make a startup to do that with an LLM. Well, that's just going to be a feature in the incumbent in 1 to 2 months, guaranteed, unless you're talking about a really, really slow incumbent. So these LLMs, it's just going to be a feature. It's going to make its way into everything. It's because it's software now, right? You don't need to hire an AI team. There's no barrier to entry. And I think there will still be benefit from having, possibly a app in the ChatGPT Marketplace, but truly most of the really valuable products are things that aren't going to just work in the ChatGPT Marketplace. Because how many apps can you truly make? How much value can you truly provide with like a one-to-one, query or chat entry and then computation? Like that is very limited. And there's more benefit coming from integrating that into a different platform or a different application.
And building on what Colin just said there, another statement I believe to be true is that there will be some central repository for all the memory about Greg or about any personal person. So Greg's style, my writing style, my preferences, all of that will be held somewhere. My hypothesis is it will not be application specific. So for example, Salesforce will have a language model that it's going to know how I interact with Salesforce. All right, that's great. So will Zoom. So will probably Chrome, right? But what's the language model and where's my central repository for all my preferences across all of those apps or whatever it may be? So the reason I bring this up is it's still unclear to me if a ChatGPT like tool will be that central repository that knows everything about me, or if a Google's going to try to go in there. Because if you think about most of my activity, it's all through the browser, right? And if you're Google and you did this for me, you'd capture 95% of what I have going on. It's still unclear how that's going to play out, but I think it's going to be a mixture of both, where applications will have their LLM, but also there's going to be a Greg LLM that's going to be personalized to me that everybody else will have as well.
So you think that'll be cross businesses, that won't be proprietary to a single company?
So I think that like obviously Salesforce will have their own and Gong will have their own and Zoom will have their own and all of that. But then in order to automate my own work, I'm going to want something more local to me. So I think that because we won't live in an LLM constrained world, like there's going to be like an infinite amount, as many language models as you want. So I think that there will be one that is personalized to me that I own, that's a little closer to me, and interacting with other LLMs from other tools.
It's really, I mean, it's inspiring me to think about like kind of like the PrivateGPT and that whole topic. I know, both of you with this kind of like enterprise B2B experience on these things, like, yeah, like, I know just from like hanging out with friends outside of the Weaviate circle that a lot of them say, I can't use ChatGPT for work because I can't just like put my documents into ChatGPT because of the security. Yeah, I'm curious, like how you see the emerging trends in this. Like, like are more like, you know, companies going to go to OpenAI and say like, hey, OpenAI, we need you to set this up inside of our cloud, like the model inference server inside our cloud? Is that something that maybe, you know, OpenAI or Cohere, you know, Anthropic, these big model providers would look to? Or would this maybe be the open source language models, or will people start, you know, training their own language models with maybe, you know, Mosaic ML and tools like that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, there's a lot there. So yeah, you're absolutely right. A lot of enterprises are not comfortable with sending data to OpenAI. There's some ways that OpenAI is getting around that. And when I say OpenAI, that'll include, you know, Google's offering, Palm, whatever, any of these language model providers. So often the way they mitigate that first objection is by saying, okay, well, now we're in your cloud provider platform, right? We're in AWS, we're in GCP, we're in Azure. So you can use that, and then you don't have to go outside of Azure. And then the next level is data retention. So I think with most of these systems, you can opt out of data retention now. That's a huge deal for InfoSec. Another step that I'm not sure exactly where we are on this is dedicated instances, right? So you can get that. You will probably be able to get dedicated instances of some of these super high performing language models pretty soon. And then it probably ends there for the managed models, right? And then you step into open source world. And in open source world, you have those previous options, but you also have private cloud, you have on-prem, and you will even have edge. And edge is also going to be interesting because we're probably close to a point where your Windows PC or Apple MacBook may end up having a LLM built into it, right? And we saw the Palm models; they had one that you could fit on smartphones, right? So at some point, the compute may come with your device, and that changes things a lot, right? Because then it doesn't leave your device. That's not, it doesn't leave your cloud. It doesn't leave your device. You can do anything you want with that. Probably. There's still a little friction just getting these InfoSec organizations to catch up with all these concepts and understand, okay, what is safe, what isn't safe? Are these things stateful? How do we know it for sure? But I was just looking at a company the other day called Ask Sage, and they're providing OpenAI for government entities, including, you know, military, right? So the fact that that is gaining traction, using those OpenAI instances and content retention turned off, is a pretty good sign that enterprises and organizations are starting to understand and realize that they need this, and they're willing to take some risks or at least understand those risks better in order to do it.
Nice. The I agree with Colin that the ability, like these model, let me rephrase. Sam Altman has another quote that I really enjoy, which is the cost of intelligence will go to zero, right? And the cost to serve that intelligence will also go to zero. Now, TBD on the timeline for that, but that's the direction it'll go. So I agree with Colin fully that the ability to have compute intelligence on our edge devices will 100% be there. Now, will will the market adopt that? That's a little bit of a different question for me. And the example I want to give is take, for example, iMessage versus Signal. Signal touts that they're end-to-end encrypted, right? Well, are we all using Signal today? Not really. We still use iMessage, and I know that there's encryption and everything around there. But I think the point is, I think that where this will go is, I think just the way that we trust Google and all these other big infra companies to handle our data, our Gmail, our drives, and all that, I think that'll be the same level of comfortability that we get to with language models. We're just we kind of jumped into a cold pool, and we're still feeling the shock of the water right now. But I have a feeling that we're going to warm up right to it. And once this becomes the norm, and a Google-like company starts to serve this for us, we're all gonna be okay with it.
Yeah, that whole thing, you know, all that introduced so many new ideas to me. I'd never actually considered LLM on the devices, like right into the chip. Like the new M1 chip also comes with a Apple GPT in it, and that's a really cool idea. All these things, and then thinking about the market adoption. Like, I think either we could take this topic further and talk maybe about like the kind of medical use cases and the evolution of that, or I think we could talk about sort of pivoting topics entirely and maybe step back into our conversation broadly on agent use. And before we dove into this, Greg, you had brought up the chain of thought, AutoGPT. So let me actually ask you guys both quickly. Do you think we should, yeah, why don't we just, as the interview host, I'll hijack the topic and let's talk about, let's talk about chain of thought prompting and AutoGPT. How do you guys currently see that?
I'll give just a very quick opinion on this. Like I said at the beginning of the interview, not only are the applications and use cases evolving, we still don't know like what's the right way to run these things in our business, which is super interesting. But the tools themselves are still evolving. So what is the best framework for an agent to think through? We're still figuring it out. And the way that we do figure this out is through market adoption. And we see what handles most of the use cases and we let the market help us figure out what to do here. Now, the fact that we're coming out with new frameworks every single week and we haven't yet settled on one, I see that as a beautiful way that innovation happens. And you can't speed this process up anymore. Let the dust settle. Let's see what kind of things come through here. And we need to trust that LangChain and Llama Index and Grip Tape and Fixie and all these folks will be the ones who will take advantage of these new frameworks and provide them for the end users like us.
Yeah, Grip Tape. I haven't heard of that one before, but I like that name behind it. Like Guardrail is another one that I know with like the preventing hallucinations, like having layers at the end of that. Yeah, it's also interesting. I mean, I guess my thing about the AutoGPT kind of craze in that is just this idea of like, coming up with a plan and then sort of executing the plan asynchronously is sort of like the computing paradigm that I think is really, really mind blowing with this kind of idea. Is like if I say, I need to come up with, I don't know, like a way to optimize my code at the lowest level, and it's like research about ARM processors, research about SIMD instructions. It's like it can like parallelize all this research and like coordinate it. How do you think about that kind of component of AutoGPT, is like letting all these language model thread? It's like a new kind of like multi-threaded programming is how I see it.
Yeah. So I think there's some challenges to adoption with the AutoGPT paradigm. And it's something that works really well for an ad hoc query, right? It's fun. It's very cool.
And it demos well.
It demos so well, right? But it lacks the things that make it valuable to a serious enterprise, an organization, and that could be anyone, right? That could be you doing your job. That could be an organization buying it for their people. That could be a university giving it to their researchers, right? And what it lacks is repeatability for one thing, and then kind of this auditability, observability that we don't quite have great frameworks for yet, but I'm sure that's coming. But to flesh out the repeatability portion a little more, let's imagine you have some knowledge workers in an organization, right? You could say, all right, look, AutoGPT can do everything that they do, but that's probably not going to work very well, because at some point you're going to need to compare that with a similar task that a different knowledge worker has done. So what I think is going to happen in these organizations are people are going to look at these knowledge worker pieces of work objects that they produce. And what you want to do is group them into basically workflows, is a term I've been using. I've heard a lot of other people use it as well. So let's just take a concrete example. You're a data scientist and you're doing topic modeling. Okay. Should be familiar to our audience, but that's something that you want to roughly follow the same pattern every single time. Because you're going to share that with other people, right? And they're going to try to replicate it. And if they try to replicate it and their AutoGPT does it a different way, you're going to get different answers. And what are you going to do? So I think what's going to happen is people will gradually approach all these problems of various fields and kind of segment them into workflows. And you'll have some very frequent ones, and you'll have a long tail, right? So you have some tasks people do a lot, topic modeling. You'll have other tasks that people do infrequently, like training a new LLM, right? And so you're going to take those high frequency workflows and you're going to try to automate them. And that might not be totally deterministic, right? There might be some routing decisions made within there. So that could be thought of as maybe a sub agent, but then you're going to have some supervisory agent that is choosing that workflow or choosing, hey, this doesn't fit with anything I'm, really trained how to do. So I'm going to go the long tail route and just go full AutoGPT. However, that's again not as likely to be as useful. Number one, because it's harder to trust, and number two, because hopefully, if you did this right, those are less frequent tasks. So if you can use your language models and your tools and your retrieval to automate these high frequency workflows, I think that's how we're going to see a lot of automation adopted in terms of these like knowledge worker tasks that people would expect AutoGPT to address.
Colin, question for you on that one. For these advanced workflows, there's kind of three pieces. There's the language model as the reasoning engine. There's the task and the prompt that you give it, and then there's the memory and the context that it receives, right? I could see one argument that says once you get to a high enough reasoning level, like a high enough intelligence level for a language model, then you could fine tune that workflow just through the prompt and through the context that you're feeding it. So, for example, the data topic modeling. Well, do you need to have a specialized reasoning engine for that data topic modeling, or do you just need one of sufficient level? Pass it the best prompt you can, pass it the instructions on how to do topic modeling in the first place, and then let it run wild.
That could end up being sufficient. Yeah, it's very possible. But even then, you have kind of added some deterministic information. You've given it a structure. So that structure, I think, over time will probably evolve toward what you described. Yeah.
Well, I think, earlier when I brought up what Yana is building with Craftful and the ChatGPT Marketplace is very similar to this idea of like, I compress like Martin Grutendorf's, the BERT topic expert, topic modeling expert, into like a set of prompts on how to run topic modeling analysis. Is like the Craftful idea is you take these prompts on how you generally do like user interviews, manage user feedback, and yeah, so it's so fascinating. I think of this as kind of like a skill prompt, and I got that kind of like skill prompt from looking at Microsoft's semantic kernel, and that's like the abstraction that came around like like a prompt for how to do question decomposition, like are follow-up questions needed. This is kind of a topic around skill prompts. It's really related to everything on agents. Is what is the evolution of few shot examples? Do we still need to give a few examples of how to use agents, or with because ChatGPT, like it seems like a lot of the time, like I think React was a paper that was like 0 shot tool use. So it's like you don't need to give it examples or train it how to use a tool. So what do you think? Few shot prompting, give it a few examples of using a tool. Is that still needed?
Yeah, I think it's definitely still needed. And you look at how people build plugins right now. Like I like that you mentioned semantic kernel. I think that's could end up being a good standard going forward, because look how they built that. They look at how everyone was building plugins and then they standardized it and generalized it, right? And that's not something you really get from the open source community, which is kind of just purely expanding. It doesn't have a good contract stage yet, whereas Microsoft with that framework has done their expand and contract already. But in terms of if you want to give a system new capabilities with a new tool, it's most likely that you want to do that with few shot. You could just describe it, but why would you do away with giving it additional information? I think there is a place that fails though, which is, let's say you have multiple tools and the tool could include a retrieval system, atomic tool, or also a workflow. Let's say these interact with each other, or they're dependent on each other in some way. Then the kind of, I'm adding a plugin, so here's my few shots and here's my interface. That kind of breaks, because you need few shots that cross between the different tools, plugins, workflows, whatever. And that may be a time where you'll need to either develop a lot more few shots, but you can also see how that would, like the permutations of that would get out of control pretty quickly, or possibly even train a specialized model to do that sort of planning that it needs to do in order to figure out how to use this environment of tools rather than just thinking about it as, I can do one or two things. Um,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I'm with Colin. Of course, nobody knows, but my hypothesis is that few shot examples will still be around because even if you craft the most perfect prompt, I don't think you're going to account for every single situation. And giving like a picture speaks 1,000 words. Well, so does a few examples as well.
Yeah, and it's been like the story of a lot of machine learning is, examples, and then just the research has been how do we learn from as little data as possible. And now we've seen that. Colin, you said something that I hadn't heard that abstraction before. Open source is about the expanding, whereas like a centralized entity is the contraction. I think that, like it makes a lot of sense. And I think that is really interesting. And then something I think is really fascinating as well is I think Greg is one of the world's experts on keeping up with this expanding of what people are doing with prompts. Greg has a series called Early AI Signals, and you can see the, Notion template, really nice organization of these things. And I think this would be a perfect transition, Greg, if you could talk about like this expanding and how you're keeping up with it.
Sure, absolutely. So, um, I have a small side project called Early Signals, and it started as an experiment, really, because there used to be the saying that every spreadsheet template was a future startup. And if you looked at the Craigslist homepage, every link on there was a future startup. It's like home rental, Airbnb, car rental, Turo, et cetera. And I was just on just social media in general, Twitter, YouTube, Hacker News, all that stuff. And I noticed that people were using ChatGPT for ways that it was not intended to be used. They didn't really know, how it was going to be used. So people saying, "Oh, I use ChatGPT for therapy." Interesting. I use ChatGPT to write my cover letters to help me with my resume and all this. And I thought to myself, man, is ChatGPT really the optimal product experience to execute against those workflows? Likely not. So this could be an opportunity to productionalize that workflow. Now, the hard part about this and the piece I need to emphasize is you do not have a defensible business if you just productionalize a prompt. So it's a starting point, I believe, and there's the hint of it, and somebody needs to go out and go build more defensibility around it. But Early Signals, I have a collection of those ideas, and it's about weekly. I try to go through and say my favorite 5, but then give folks the access to. I think we're up to like 70 or 80 different workflows, and the important part for each one of these is that I need to show where a user has said that they do this thing. So I don't want it to be somebody's idea. I want it to be a user says, "I do this right now." And so you already have a little bit of user for, adoption for it right there.
Yeah, I think it's so useful. It's such a cool, it's so interesting just going through it. I think like from like the AI girlfriend to like the yeah, just like the whole collection of all these things that people do with it. And I mean, yeah, I am just like I'm still kind of like my mind is blown through my head thinking about this kind of open source expansion kind of idea, because I do think like LangChain, like when it first came out, the way that it was like open source and this kind of collecting the prompts, and it's very similar to what you're doing with the early AI signals, is just like maybe if I connected to like Hugging Face and the Model Hub, the open source, like how they've managed to seize open source. And it's like, because they have, it's like, what are we going to do with this new tool? And it's so creative. It's just pretty interesting.
Quickly on that one. I think another Sam Altman quote that I really enjoy, and I keep on quoting him here, but um, the reason he states why they release slow is because the collective intelligence of the human population is unpredictable. They have no idea what humans are going to do. So it's like, all right, here's ChatGPT. What do people do? Here's plugins. What do people do? Here's API, et cetera, et cetera. Um, I think that open source moves quick. Like you're talking about indie hackers all over the world that are putting out really innovative ideas. One of the prime examples of this is Baby AGI. The founder of that was not a technical by trade person per se. He's a VC. So how cool is it that somebody who isn't necessarily technical is building this tool that all people around the world can take advantage of? And I think that speaks to the open source types of world on there. Now, um, proprietary and closed will catch up to it, but they're driven less by let's provide um, selfless innovation out into the world, and they're more commercially driven. But it all follows.
I think it depends on the stage we're in also, right? Because we're still very early, and talking about something like agents, no one even agrees on the abstractions, right? Like I was looking at Fixie, which is a pretty cool company, and they have a open source package available for agents as well, and they call everything agents. So like a plugin for them is an agent, right? So we can't even agree on the abstractions, and eventually we probably will. And at that point, we need to contract the um, we need to focus, right? And that's not something we're getting a lot of at this stage from tools like LangChain for the general agent stuff, and from Llama Index, your other example, for the ingestion stuff, right? I think both of these started out very successful because they gave random people quick cookbooks on how to put things together, right? That was the value they provided. It was simple abstractions, a collection of wrappers. That was basically it. Like, I think a lot of people ended up starting using LangChain just because it was marginally, 4 lines of code easier to do that and instantiate Weaviate than it was to instantiate Weaviate from the Weaviate documentation, which isn't the fault of Weaviate. That's just how software works, right? So they made a wrapper that shrunk it. And same with the OpenAI endpoint. So that was valuable to people for a while. And I think a lot of people are still primarily deriving value from it for that reason. However, as it balloons, as it gets bigger and bigger, you're going to start to lose the cookbook of the system because there's too many options. And I think you'll see that happen to Llama Index really quickly. Is everybody builds a different document parser, right? And so all of a sudden I go to this GitHub and I want to find a document parser, and instead of having 3 options where the differences are clearly articulated, I now have 2,500, right? Because that's what you're going to have. Look at Hugging Face. It even happens on Hugging Face. How many models are on Hugging Face? Thousands. How many of them are useful? Very, very few. We don't trust Hugging Face to tell us which Hugging Face models are useful, even. We often get that from somewhere else. So yeah, these open source expanding frameworks will need to be careful, and be sure to do some contracting at some point, or else these frameworks that are much more opinionated, like semantic kernel, are going to eat their lunch, because they were developed kind of with the same process originally, right? These Microsoft people just built a bunch of plugins, but then they took that learning and in an organized way turned it into a true framework um, that people could agree on and was as widely valuable.
Yeah, that is just gold insights. I feel like I took away so much from that. I mean, like we think a lot about the Weaviate cookbook and how we want to design this thing, and yeah, it's like, text search with this data set, text search with that slightly different data set where you'd use different properties. Is that the best way to design a cookbook, or do you just end up with like 2,000 examples of Weaviate, and it's like that just confuses you compared to like one text, one image, one multimodal, and just keeping it to the point? It's pretty fascinating. I guess I kind of like, in this topic of open source, I thought maybe there was a link to jump to this next topic, which is multi-agent systems, like where we have, it's kind of like, it kind of is similar to AutoGPT to me, but like, say you have like multiple agents that like live in some kind of simulation. I mean, I had Yu Sheng Wu on the podcast, who's built Chat Arena, and what Chat Arena is about is like, we, Greg, Colin, Connor, we each are like retrieval augmented chatbots that talk to each other, and maybe a third language model is judging like who's saying the best points and stuff, like these kind of like chat games. But like, how do you think about that kind of like multi-agent LLM systems?
I quick comment on that one. If you were to ask why do we do this multi-agent thing in the first place, and it's really a deficiency in the current models right now not to be able to handle that type of computation or that type of prediction or whatever it may be, right? And so I think that, is the use case going to be there in the future where you want to interact with an arena of people? Sure. We're seeing the market already want that right now. Is the answer multi-agent? Well, it's a pretty convenient way to constrain one agent to like think about a certain thing and constrain its memory and all that. Is that the only way you can construct that type of application? No. And so is that the framework that I think is going to be the one that persists? Still TBD. I'm not going to make a hypothesis on that yet.
Yeah, I think you're totally on base, Greg. a lot of, the reason you do that is to make up for their shortcomings. And if you had a smarter model, why would you need to have two of them talking to each other if it can just, understand, okay, well, I've got this stuff in my context and I should do something a little differently. Because that's all the other one does. It's just like they're just swapping contexts in a different sort of way. I think the place where we might see more of that being necessary is, further toward the edge, more open source, where you maybe have the smaller specialized models, like for example that one we kind of talked about, where it's trained to use a certain group of tools together. But as you get smarter models, it shouldn't be as important.
I mean, I think it's just absolutely fascinating. I think it's very related to just like real companies, kind of like if I think about how like, if I'm playing these roles in this multi-agent system, the first person is like looking at the Twitter feed, doing the early AI signals curation, and then sees this thing and says, I think this could fit in Weaviate, just like someone who's just picking things I think could go in Weaviate. Then you pass that to like the product manager role playing LM who, has this particular retrieval and maybe also fine tuning to use those kind of tools to say, okay, here's the proposal. Then the engineer, who's more familiar with the code base and the internals of the database and stuff, like, okay, and then uses the chains of like the, code execution tool used to like prototype and develop a prototype. And then, you have like some kind of maybe internal pull request review that happens with role playing of like different engineer LLMs. And then you have like the marketing and like, without explaining like all the roles of an engineering company, like, do you think that thing would be superseded by just one large language model that sees the new thing on Twitter, however it ingests data, however it comes up with ideas, and just end to end, just I don't need this kind of role playing. It's just like totally unnecessary.
I think my previous statement was just assuming they're all built in from the same language model and the same model that comes in from there. Now, when you start to speak around specialized tasks, I think in that case, it's still TBD, but a lot of popular opinion is around that you're going to have specialized models that come around. And then with that, if that precipitates specialized agents, then you'll have a multi-agent world to complete those tasks.
Yeah, I mean, it's like, well, they're kind of like two emerging topics in large language models, I think, which is the first of which is fine tuning is becoming cheaper. We see like the Q LoRa, like quantized low rank adaptation, that's making it look like you can, I think they say they fine tuned a 65 billion parameter large language model on a 48 gigabyte GPU. And so it's like that kind of thing is going to get a lot easy, like way easier than it's ever been, right? How do you think about that kind of trends in fine tuning?
Yeah, I mean, they're definitely making progress. I think there's still some unknowns. There was a paper that came out recently talking about how non the non-managed models, it turns out, don't generalize nearly as well as things like GPT 3.5. So I'm sure we can link that. I don't recall the title of it at the moment. But if you look at that, what is it saying? It's saying these open source models aren't as good as we thought they were, and they don't generalize as well to unseen tasks. That actually makes a case for more fine tuning, right? If your business has certain tasks you expect you'll need to do, there's more need for you to fine tune those models. Again, stepping aside from the super powerful models, the GPT-4s of the world, if you're going toward these smaller models, then yeah, fine tuning will probably be more important, and it does seem to be getting way cheaper. And that goes hand in hand with the hosting costs or the inference costs as well, right? They're kind of tightly correlated. So with that Clora paper, that was really cool. I'm excited about that. Yeah, you can run inference and training for now. It's accessible to, you need a couple talented people to do it probably, but that's kind of your only obstacle.
Yeah, I think that's exactly correct. I mean, you need to then have like the, all the ML ops skills to take advantage of that kind of thing. But then if it saves you that much money compared to like all these repeated inferences of the super smart thing. So then the second big trend I'm very curious about are these like really long input lengths. Like Anthropic says 100K input lengths. How do you think that'll change agents?
I don't know. Do you know how they do that? Either of you guys know how they did that? Did they just pay the price, or did they have some trick? I feel like people are still trying to figure that out.
Well, I think with Mosaic's MPT, talked about alibi attention and how you can do this kind of like sparse attention where, yeah, I mean, I don't know the exact mechanics of it, and I'm sure they optimize it like all the way down to the CUDA cores and like, have a lot of engineering that goes into that. But
Yeah, one quick thought about it, and then I'd love to hear what you think, Greg. But with the longer attention, I think training probably becomes a lot more difficult and expensive too. So beyond the compute, which ordinarily with attention scales quadratically, right? That's a problem. But then also, if you want to generate fine tuning examples that that replicate some long context tasks that you want to do in the wild, you need to generate some examples of that, right? And so if you're having people write 80,000 word examples, then you're going to spend a lot of money doing that. And you probably need pretty smart people generating those examples. But then the other side of things is with longer context length, some applications look different, right? You don't have to do as much retrieval. There's a certain window that opens up of data where you can just put that in the context, in the prompt. And it's not clear how much further we'll be able to go. But that definitely does change. Okay, how often do you need to do retrieval you can put some in the prompt.
yeah, well, I think maybe I'm wearing the adversarial hat being in a vector database company, but we're already seeing papers like large language models are distracted by irrelevant context. Colin, in your haystack presentation, you talked about n greater than one search result in the prompt. It becomes trickier. So yeah, I think that it's the pro of retrieval is like you could still pack 100,000 with all sorts of information sources as you search across classes with different queries and stuff just to pack this prompt as densely as possible. Yeah, and then generally I think it'd be hard to train those models. I agree with that.
Yeah, and for me, I think that long context length, it demos really well. It does well on Twitter, and I think the reason why people are excited about it because it storytells really well too. It's like, oh, now pass a book into this whole thing. However, the minute the benchmarks start to go down, I become less interested. And so, really, it's kind of a dramatic statement. I don't care. I don't care as much about context length at all. I want improved reasoning, cheaper, and then longer context. Well, no, improved reasoning, cheaper, lower latency, and then longer context lengths for that. Because, like Colin said, which I agree with, it's a bit of it's a controversial statement, but a longer context length allows you to be lazier on retrieval, and it almost makes up for your inability to not do retrieval as well as you should be doing in the first place. Potentially, I know it's a bit of an overstatement, but I think that I am fine with managing a shorter context length and needing to beef up my deterministic retrieval to start uh, than somebody saying, "Oh, now you can do 1 million tokens."
It forces you to build a better system, doesn't it?
Yeah, fascinating. Greg and Colin, I thought this was such a great tour of all these topics of LLM agents. I mean, I learned so much from this podcast. Wrapping it up, Greg and Colin, could you each maybe give listeners like where to find you, keep up with your content? Hopefully, they were inspired by the podcast and want to just dive into all the online content you have.
Yeah, absolutely. So, two places on YouTube. I run underneath a channel called Data Independent. You can find me over there with a bunch of LangChain content, early signals, and all that good stuff. And then most of my communication happens on Twitter. So I'm just at Greg Kamradt.
Hey everyone, apologies. The recording crashed right as we were doing the outros. You can find Colin on his blog at colinharmon.substack.com, and you can also find Colin on LinkedIn at Colin Harmon. One more quick bonus on the outro. You can check out Colin's new talk at Haystack US 2023, Stop Hallucinations and Half-Truths in Generative Search, now uploaded to the Open Source Connections YouTube channel. As a bonus, you can see the Ortus Chrome plugin from Lexicgordic, this new AI summarization tool for YouTube, another really cool thing. And then also in the spirit of it, here's Greg's channel, Data Independent. So many incredible videos on LangChain tutorials, new things about AI, the early signals series, all sorts of cool stuff. So thank you so much for watching the podcast, and please be sure to check out Greg and Colin's videos as well as all sorts of other content. Thanks again.